As its name implies, Park City, Utah has a few parks, but there's an ample amount of non-lift access trails between and beyond those parks. It was a perfect place to test the limits of a long-travel 27.5-inch bike like the Mission Carbon from Diamondback, who has successfully taken on the role of being sort of a working-class high-end brand. They do the consumer direct model, sort of a hybrid consumer direct and get them at bike shops, but they tend to focus on value. I mean, case in point, this $4,000 full carbon bike. And there's a $5,000 version of it, and I feel like that was half of our discussion when we were kind of getting a handle on this bike, was, is that a good choice to get a full carbon bike, but try and get at a given price point?
Well, yeah, it's at this level, right, where like you can either get a really nice aluminum framed bike with good components on it, or you can get a carbon framed bike with some lower end bits. And for me, I feel like the suspension components in particular let this bike down.
I agree. You know, and when you look at a bike like this, it's got everything there that you want. It's got a really great suspension platform, and you can feel that it's right there. And like you said, the suspension kind of let it down, I felt like.
Yeah.
So that platform, so what you're starting with, I mean, if you look at the silhouette of this bike, it is every bit a 2019 bike. It has a steep 75.5 seat angle, it's a 64-degree head angle, and it's long, even though they don't do an extra large, so it was a little tight on me. Mm-hmm. But and it has a essentially VPP suspension that on its own works really well. But I think that the spirit of that in the suspension needed a little bit of help.
Sure.
And maybe it would be nice to have a lockout on the climbs, but sort of didn't have it.
I mean, that was the first thing I noticed. No lockout on the climb, and I felt like I was wallowing a little bit, you know, with a, you know, kind of entry-level rear shock. It just didn't feel like it was there. You know, and it didn't actually bother me as much on the downhill. I still felt like it was pretty balanced. I did feel the Yari got a little overwhelmed on the downs, but yeah, just keep coming back to like, well, what if? What if we had a little bit more, you know?
And I think that's really important to focus on here, is that there is one for 5K that has a Float X2 rear shock, has a Fox 36 fork, and better components throughout. And again, the bones of this bike are pretty dialed. Mm-hmm. So if you really want a carbon bike for 4K, you can drop a Charger damper into the fork for $260. You're still left with kind of a lackluster dropper. You're left with the lackluster rear shock.
You know, is the person that's buying this bike, are they the type that's going to say, yep, and let's upgrade this and upgrade this and upgrade this? I think, you know, you get in at $4,000 and you want it to be a bike you can take and ride all season. Yeah, I mean, that's who I think it's for, right?
Yeah, and I think like for you know, a young kid who's like mostly shredding the park, I think this build's going to be fine for them. Mm-hmm. They're going to put a bunch of air in the shock and in the fork.
Totally.
And they're just going to send it, you know, and they're going to have a great time. They're not going to think all that hard about what the suspension's doing. For someone who has ridden more bikes, who knows how they really want their suspension to feel in a more nuanced way, I think they're going to struggle with this build. But yeah, as you were saying, that $5,000 build, better choice for that person.
Really, the issues we had with the Mission Carbon 1C can be solved by spending an extra $1,000, and you'd still end up with a machine of incredible value. But we talked a little too much about value. The Mission Carbon wouldn't want you to get hung up on that stuff. It would just want to go out there and have fun. It being a 27.5-inch bike, I think it plays to the strengths of what a bike like this is meant for. Almost like a classic brawler, like you say, a park bike, or, gosh, to even get more classic, free ride bike.
Yeah, I feel like I could, you know, pick this thing up and just land in a big rock garden and it'd be fine. It was a mobby feeling, plush, pretty like linear feeling rear suspension, but not to a fault. Like it was just a nice plush rear suspension and it didn't bottom easily.
And there's room for more volume spacers. If you want to make this more poppy, there's room for 2 more spacers in there. So you can make it more rampy if you're a bigger rider or if you're that advanced park rat.
Yeah. Now the one thing that is irredeemable about this frame is there's nowhere to put a water bottle. And for me, like that's kind of a deal breaker
for you, for sure.
Real deal breaker, yeah. And it's also something that like, it turns me off in terms of like buying this frame with an eye towards upgrading it, because I'm just like, I can never put a water bottle on it. So I don't really want to have it long term.
I think the classic rider who's just used to having a hydration pack, used to having all the stuff they need hanging in their laundry room and just put the water in there. Like there's, like we argue with Palmer all the time about like strapping tubes and bags to your bike and all that. Like I think that there's a spectrum of that, and there's people that are totally fine with doing things the way they've been doing it since they started riding.
But a counter to that, I kind of see this bike appealing to like a young shredder rider. Like I don't think they're the type of rider that's going to put a water bottle on it. And I think they're really going to like what this bike does in the downs and how it corners and how it performs. It's a really balanced, like confident bike. You know?
And it looks sick too. Like it's got
Yeah.
a really nice silhouette, and
Absolutely.
you can't put a bottle on it to that up.
Totally. Absolutely.
And if you have that youthful, playful spirit about the way you ride, it's got a 430 chainstay for a bike with these numbers. I think that shows the decision that Diamondback made with this bike. There's all these brands that are lengthening the chainstays as they go with longer travel bikes to aim at stability and ground hugginess and maybe conservatism. Like
This is pretty unapologetic.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the way it's set up. It's confident in what it's trying to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's consistent with what we'd want a bike like this to be about. It's a straightforward, big hit, long travel bike that's just practical enough to pedal up the hill if you don't have all of Park City's chairlifts. The higher end shocks on the pricier 2C model will better serve anyone as spoiled as our testers are, but for anyone else, this model has it where it counts. We've got the full review and the rest of the Bible videos at bikemag.com.